Class 1, as you noted, there's no approval process, but you do register and list with the FDA. Class 2 could be a 510K or a de novo petition, and then Class 3 is the highest risk product. So there's kind of some differences between Class 1 and Class 2 in terms of how big a deal that is to choose which one you're in. Typically, it's not hard. You're looking for products like yourselves to look up in the regulations to find, gee, how does the FDA regulate my product? And if you're Class 1, kind of a home run from the regulatory perspective, it might not be a product that garners as much reimbursement or monetary benefit, if you will, because they're usually simpler products. If you have a choice between there's not typically an opportunity to have a choice, if you will, between Class 1 and Class 2 or 510K and just registering and listing. But there's definitely gray area between Class 2 and Class 3 and 510K and de novo and PMA. And we can dive into a number of areas of difference, but the 510K is a 90-day process that's generally pretty straightforward. Although if your product is new or uses a new technology, something different than a predicate, you might fall into a de novo, or you might twist yourself into a pretzel trying to fit into the predicate space. And sometimes that's quite hard to do. There's some benefits in terms of time and cost, et cetera, with being a 510K. And there's some benefits with the de novo because you get to really decide your own labeling and your own claims about your product, what it does. You don't have to kind of be surreptitious in how you describe things in order to fit into a category because you're making a new category. And then between de novo and PMA, again, often you don't have a choice on that because the PMA products are considered high-risk products. And it's usually pretty clear when you're developing a product whether you fall into the high-risk, life-sustaining, life-supporting product or not. Sometimes you may be able to down-regulate them through the de novo process, but that's usually something that the FDA is more familiar with already. Maybe there's been a number of products that have come along and the FDA is feeling like they understand it well enough that it could be down-regulated. But we can dive into kind of lots of nuances in terms of labeling and marketing and the process. So the FDA did come out with sort of a new set of rules right at the same time that COVID happened, really, where they decided to use enforcement discretion on general wellness devices, meaning those products are so low risk that the FDA, while they could be considered a medical device, the FDA is not going to require companies to do any notifications or register and list and those kinds of things. So general wellness products are pretty simple from a regulatory perspective. However, you have to be very careful in your labeling. You don't want to talk about how they're treating or diagnosing a medical condition or disease. Otherwise, in digital health, those products are really regulated pretty much in the same way in terms of Class 1, 2, and 3. They are that process is based on the risk of the product and what damage it could cause if it was misused or didn't work as anticipated. And so it's a similar regulatory process. Register and list for a Class 1, 510K or de novo, and PMA. And the kind of information that you provide is similar, but you can imagine, you're not describing the hardware, et cetera. You're providing a lot of software documentation. And you're also describing the level of concern of your software. That's sort of a subcategory of risk. Again, what could happen if your software went wrong or there was a bug in it that caused a problem? And so when you determine the level of concern of your software, that determines how detailed the information is that you need to provide to the FDA. So design control is essentially a recipe for your product. You have to write down, how do you make the product, what goes into it, what gets added when, who touches it, how you sterilize it, all the details so that you could pass it on to a new owner and they could take that recipe and make your product exactly the same. Software has very similar requirements. It starts with what does the user need out of this product, and it trickles down into greater and greater detail. And for a very low risk product, you might just provide your user need documentation to the FDA. For a very high risk product, you would provide your user needs, your software design specifications, your software requirement specifications, et cetera, all the way down in great detail. And that's a lot of paperwork that generally software folks aren't used to doing. They aren't used to writing down everything that they've done to come up with their coding, et cetera.
So Intervene was started out of the fellowship in 2011 by myself and a couple other co-founders. Ended up sort of the others kind of ran off to different things, and so for a while it was myself, but I was able to build a team, and Peggy came on to be our sort of regulatory guru from very early on. And we worked at Biodesign for 1 year after the fellowship on a generous kind of grant from Dr. Crummell, and then moved on to the Fogarty Institute. Dr. Fogarty is a vascular surgeon, and as you'll see, this is sort of a vascular product. He was a mentor, is a mentor of mine, and was really helpful in kind of teaching me a lot of the lessons we'll talk about today. We spent a couple of years there, and then kind of rolled out to South San Francisco. The company is, well, why don't I'll tell you what it does, and then we'll talk about where we're at now. So the original problem we identified in the Biodesign Fellowship, it was sort of a cardiovascular year, was originally around the disease state of chronic venous insufficiency, an inability to consistently pump blood back out of your legs against gravity back up to your heart. This sort of manifests in two main pathophysiologies, kind of obstruction, where you have clot or other kind of disease states on the inside of the vein to prevent blood from flowing, or vein valve reflux. And so you may know that veins have one-way valves to prevent blood from going backwards. If those valves break down or fail, often due to clot, they aren't functional anymore. And then, the disease progresses from kind of varicose veins, which more than half of the people on this planet have some form of, or at least the C1 part of the disease, but it's very common and prevalent. C3 is when you start getting sort of the pressure from that blood that's not able to get out of the legs, kind of oozing through the vein walls and into the interstitial space, and you have kind of edema. C4 is when that actually gets to the point of skin breakdown and chronic dermatitis, where there's really no going back. The skin is permanently damaged, painful, and discolored. And then a percentage of those patients will then bump their leg, and it'll turn into an ulcer that will last a week, a month, or the rest of their lives, often getting recurrent ulcers. And these are just typically on the medial ankle, but actually a quite large percentage of people have these and hide them quite well from the rest of the world. So we were surprised to see sort of the numbers. I'm too far away from this now to remember them accurately, but a lot of people are affected by this disease. So we were interested in the solutions, which if you have obstruction is basically a stent. So technology is kind of borrowed from the arterial side and ported into the venous. That only works kind of if the obstruction is high enough. And then if you have a reflux in the superficial veins, the kind of the side streets, not the highways, it would be kind of close the vein down with energy. And then if the problem was in the deep veins, there was nothing. And so that's really where we focused. We also found a lot of literature pointing the most severe symptoms in the patients with the most recurrent problem having deep vein reflux, and kind of had the thesis that is probably the cause. So our initial need statement was to sort of focus on the deep vein reflux side and the more severe symptom side. And it said a better way to improve symptoms in C4B to C6 chronic venous insufficiency patients with deep vein reflux. And reading this now, the company is 12 years old. There's something in this statement that led to the fact that the company is not currently a massive success. So it's actually a good lesson in the importance of the need statement. But I'll leave that as a cliffhanger. We found this Italian surgeon, one of my co-fellows. We had come up with this idea of maybe we could just carve a valve out of the inside of the vein wall using the different layers. That night, one of our fellows found this paper from an Italian surgeon, and we were like, "Oh no, we've been scooped. Someone already thought of this." And then we realized, oh, this is great. This person's done 9 years of R&D for us. And so what this person was doing is sort of an open surgical procedure, very invasive, down to the middle of the leg, opening the vein up and just literally like a MacGyvering a kind of flap of tissue out of the inside of the wall to create a valve that didn't have any sort of implant. There had been 30 years of attempts to create implantable vein valves, but because blood moves so slowly and is sort of static, they had all historically failed due to clots. And so this procedure was the first thing we saw. It was like 40 patients, but like one DVT, and you would expect 70 to 80% DVTs in any of these patients from other attempts. So we said, wow, it's actually safe if we could just do this with a catheter and not have to do this really technical surgery. That could be cool. So that's what we did. It took many years, actually. I'd say like 4 solid years of just R&D, and Peggy helped us get some early clinical cases in New Zealand, but many years in developing sort of a little catheter that could basically go in. We eventually got to intravascular ultrasound imaging, kind of in line with the catheter, to kind of give us a view of the cross section. You can kind of see it that in the lower left corner there, of what we're doing in real time. And then we used hydrodissection, a tiny little needle, very carefully placed into a wall that's being supported by a catheter with a balloon on it, to kind of create a bubble within the vein wall and create access. The device then has like a little lever where you throw that forward, and over the needle, you kind of put this spreading tool that actually does all the dissection with carefully placed blades and 18 iterations over time of what angle those blade, arms should be at and the size, and the company's still optimizing on that, but was able to kind of create this device where, now a doctor can create like 8 of these leaflets in one procedure in about 2 hours. So sometimes doing bicuspid valves. One of the most recent cases was three different valves, 2 of them bicuspid, 1 monocuspid, up and down the leg, to try to recreate natural valves. Pretty quickly, I think Peggy helped me understand that, like, the exact, like, is it a de novo 510K? Is it a PMA? Like, early on when you're fundraising, and, it obviously depends on the product, but maybe that matters less than what is our strategy for kind of designing, incorporating clinical into this, and what is really the clinical trial that's ultimately going to be needed for regulatory, but also kind of for other, maybe reimbursement and just general kind of marketability. And so kind of thinking through it more holistically from the start, like what can we envision the clinical trial that we would need to have to show that this thing is both safe and effective. But there was clearly no obvious predicate from the start. So it wasn't really a question, will this be a straight 510K? Whether, it's a de novo or PMA, honestly, still isn't even completely figured out, and hasn't been as big of an issue in this specific case, I'd say. But Peggy, can you think of some early stuff we were thinking about?
Well, I was going to say, like you said, that whether it's a de novo or a PMA, I think part of that is about the company. We, the company, were sort of open to either way, and it was very dependent on, gee, what did our investors say? What are they feeling? Where are we going with this? Are we going to be a standalone company? Are we going to get swooped up? Because you could imagine a tool like this could be fabulous for those that are in, big companies in the vascular space. And as I said, for them, generally a PMA is kind of no big deal. And so we kind of, we just let that ride. And it also, your investors evolve. So in the beginning, there were small investors, and then there's a strategic investor involved now. And so, you don't worry about that so much, but I think I don't know if we underestimated, but we've needed a lot of clinical experience, and we continue to need a lot of clinical experience.
Wow. So this journey is still very much ongoing.
Yes.
Yeah. It's 12 years in. So,
yeah.
And that's another lesson is I do think the clinical and regulatory, and to some extent reimbursement kind of questions early on are going to massively have an impact on the timeline. And so I think that's something to think about early. It's like, what kind of project is this? And what kind of funding is it going to need to get to certain milestones? And I think you kind of need to start linking your fundraising plan to the risk profile on the regulatory reimbursement and clinical side.
One thing I'll comment on is that we've had a number of FDA meetings, and this was pretty much pre-COVID where we could be there in person. And one of the most challenging things, I think, well, two things. One, the product is very complicated. There's a lot of moving parts. It can be hard to understand. And then we were kind of plagued by a very much rotating cast of reviewers. So at the FDA, when you make a regulatory submission, you have one reviewer that's in charge of your file. And that person really brings together the experts. Maybe it's biostats, maybe it's biocompatibility, maybe it's sterilization, maybe it's clinical. And so they're supposed to corral everyone. And you don't even have necessarily the same experts or subject matter experts. And so we had probably 5 or 6 reviewers. I mean, it was kind of unfortunate, but the FDA does have a fair amount of turnover. And also we had some very fresh out of college reviewers. And so one of the meetings that we had, one of the telephone conferences we had, which wasn't even an official meeting of any sort, was when we got kind of our last new reviewer. Fletcher and I got on the phone and just walked through what the device is, how it works, explaining everything in detail, because there was a long file behind that new person that came in, but they're juggling 1,000 balls and you really need to educate them. So, but even in the very beginning, I would say it was tricky to educate the teams that we had.
I'm not the CEO now. I'm on the board of directors, so I can kind of speak so much. But if I was CEO, I would just kind of say everything. But in general, the company is in kind of clinical trial land, I would say, and raising money to continue to convince the FDA that this is ready to start a pivotal study. I think the thing that has been the hardest. So the product has probably been in, I don't know, 45, 50 people in 6 different countries in maybe 3 different clinical trials, including the United States right now. And I think what the company is continuing to try to improve on is the ability to kind of prove that this is having an efficacious result. We've had amazing safety the whole way through. So that original kind of insight from Maletti has held. I think the other question is, can you create valves that are, is this disease so powerful that it's hard to kind of overcome it with these valves? How long do they last? How do you measure that they are doing something hemodynamically? Ended up being the biggest question. And sort of how are we going to prove that, and in what time frame does it need to last? This no implant, maybe someone goes in every year and gets their valves touched up. And so the company is still in those active discussions and kind of negotiations, so to speak, with the FDA. I think we've had while we had a rotating cast of sort of reviewers, we've had sort of one consistent vascular surgeon kind of expert on the panel, and without saying anything publicly, that is basically all I'll say is, doctors will sometimes have like a viewpoint, and you can either try to change their mind or just kind of design things to kind of work for them. And I think we made an early assumption that improving symptoms would be all we need to show. If we can show that ulcers are healing and legs are getting less swollen, etc., that's enough. I think why I brought up the need statement thing is really what is needed is sort of more of a hemodynamic metric to prove you place a valve and this number goes from here to here. Early on, that was always something. The veins are compliant structures. They're not like rigid pipes. And so measuring things in them is difficult because it depends how much water you drink that day, how much you've been standing up that day, etc. And so we always have struggled with this sort of, we'll do this great procedure, and then how do we know if it worked or not? And patients all tell you it's great. And early on, I'd say another lesson is we probably allowed the doctors to provide too much of the feedback in the early cases. So everything looked great. We could raise money. But really, like the more we sort of became unbiased in how you evaluate these things, it certainly still looks like it's doing something, but it's not so definitive. And I think that's really been the question of Intervene, and continues. And I think they're going to continue to optimize the device and hopefully kind of get past that threshold, and or diagnostic techniques will get better and better to be able to like better kind of find a signal in a noisy analysis. I think it's also fair to say, it's not so cut and dry. I think if clinical symptoms are so much better and there's a signal that is 10x what you would expect, the emphasis on hemodynamic metric would be lower. So that would be if I was on the FDA's side of this argument, how I would kind of defend their stance, and that makes sense. I think it's sort of a combination of signal magnitude and noise in a sense.
And time. So ulcer healing is, of course, fabulous, but that takes time. And the condition is multifactorial. So is it about what you did? Or is it about the patient's getting a little more TLC, or for whatever reason is more mobile? There's a lot of things that go into it. So the FDA and we mentally, we, the company, would like to see that hemodynamic change to really put the objective win in.
Yeah. I think like a fun, if I were doing this again and thinking of a new project and trying to think through like the future of what the regulatory and clinical, scenario might be, like, I think it would be good to really like get a doctor in that space, buy them a beer, sit down and like just ask them to like literally go through 30 patients. Let's pretend we just treated a patient. What do you think would happen? What are the types of like safety issues? And like have them literally like pretend they're a simulation and kind of come up with like, well, probably 3 out of 30 would have this side effect. And if it really worked, it would be that. And like really make yourself go to the full on like, what would that trial actually look like? What are the types of safety issues we would have? What would it look like if the efficacy is clearly working? Like what would that headline be at the top of that slide? And so really kind of think even a level farther than you ever could, just to kind of start understanding the risks, so you can try to find like in an animal model or in some other way, a quick way to like go straight after the red hot risks as early as possible in the process.